Day 1, April 2018. After a full day of travel yesterday and a very late arrival, it was lovely to wake up at our first hotel, Hacienda La Casa Jimenita. The historic estate sits on a large acreage that serves as an ecological reserve, particularly known for the diversity of birds that can be seen there. We were served breakfast beside a wood-burning fireplace to take the chill off of the early morning Andean air. We were also accompanied by the owner's French bulldog, Fairs. We spent a while exploring the reserve and brought carrots to feed to the llamas. The property was unexpectedly hilly, and I was definitely feeling the altitude on any minor uphill slope. We made our way to Quito's old town around midday, being passed on the drive by the presidential motorcade. We dropped our bags off at the Friends Hostel and set out exploring. Most people here don't speak any more English than I can speak Spanish, but we managed well enough and haven't ordered any mystery meats yet. Our first stop was a patio for lunch, where we were struck by just how few tourists there seemed to be here. I was also surprised by the strong police presence. There seemed to be an officer walking past every couple of minutes. After lunch, we walked to the Plaza Grande, where the presidential palace is located. We decided to go for a tour at the Metropolitan Cathedral of Quito, where we climbed the smallest spiral staircase I've ever encountered up to the roof. Photos weren't allowed inside the cathedral, but we got plenty of scenic shots from the rooftop dome. We made our way back to the hostel at this point to properly check into our room. We're on a third-floor walk-up, but it's only a block and a half away from the main plaza. We have a spacious private room and bath with a nice view. We settled in a bit, freshened up, and made a plan for the rest of the day. We caught a taxi to the Teleférico cable car that goes up the Pichincha volcano. There were some rain clouds threatening, but we seemed to miss it, if any fell. The cable car travels a length of 2.5 kilometers in 18 minutes and covers an elevation from 10,226 feet to 12,943 feet. From the lookout points at the top, you can hike up several hours more to the summit, which seems to be perpetually shrouded in clouds. We just took in to sweeping vistas of the city below before taking the return trip down. Quito is the second most populous city in Ecuador, with a population of approximately 2.6 million. Because of its location in the Guayllamba River Valley, it stretches 40 kilometers north to south, but only 5 kilometers at its widest point. It's quite a sight to behold. We picked up a random taxi at the Teleférico station, and I immediately regretted that decision. The seatbelts didn't fasten and time was clearly money for this driver, as I slid wildly around the back seat at every turn. It was a bit of a wild ride, but we got back to the Plaza Grande in record time, and in one piece. There's some sort of civil unrest going on in Quito currently. As we arrived back in the plaza, there was a demonstration going on with maybe 50 people gathered, listening to a very impassioned speaker. This was not unusual in itself, but the nearby squadron of police decked out in riot gear was slightly unsettling. Mind you, they seemed more bored than anything else, so probably nothing too concerning. We had a fantastic dinner at a restaurant on the plaza called Hasta la Vuelta, Señor. It was on the top floor of a third-floor walk-up. Not a lot of elevators in Quito. Our restaurant is on the top level of the courtyard. By the time we left the restaurant, the riot police had left, although the demonstration still seemed to be going on. There's a nice clear crispness to the air here in the evenings. We got a couple of scenic night shots before coming back to the hostel for the evening. We don't have anything arranged for tomorrow, but the general plan is to go to the equator, an artisans' market, and the basilica. Quito. Day 2, April 21, 2018. We got a nice sleep in this morning. Well, I did anyway. Andrew was woken up at 5 a.m. to some kind of parade marching down the street nearby, with chanting, singing, and firecrackers. He opened up the window to film it and said it was like they were inside our room. I had my earplugs in and slept through the whole thing. We had breakfast at our hostel and arranged for a driver to take us to the equator and the artisanal market. It was about a 45-minute drive to the Mitad to the Mundo, the attraction built up around the equator. This site was identified as latitude 000 by a French survey team in 1736, and the 100-foot tall monument here was built in 1972. As it turns out, thanks to GPS mapping, we now know that this site is actually located at latitude 008, with actual zero being about 240 meters away. The government seems pretty set on their monument, though. I'm a bit surprised they haven't bought up the weird little sideshow site that now sits at the actual zero coordinates. The properties are immediately next door to one another. After an hour at the Meta del Mundo, our driver, Alex, announced that he was going to take us to the Pulahua crater. Neither of us knew what that was, but we went along with it. The crater is the caldera of an extinct volcano that was first inhabited by the Inca many centuries ago. Today, 30 families live there, farming. The crater has its own microclimate, and despite being very close to the equator, where we were frying under the sun, it was cool and misty at the rim of the crater. We headed back to Quito, and Alex dropped us off at the Mercado Artesanal. We actually ended up going to a nearby park where quite a few artists had stalls set up. From there, we did a very North American thing. We went to a McDonald's for lunch. I know, all this amazing food, and we ate at a McDonald's. Yes, it was there, we were hungry, it was easy. Except that it was a total mob scene inside. It was easily the busiest McDonald's I'd ever seen, and it took about 20 minutes to get our order. I was getting really hangry. Hunger satiated, we finally went to the market where it was 90% blankets, ponchos and t-shirts, 7% coffee and chocolate, 2% trinkets, and 1% genuinely interesting stuff. We left with a small watercolor painting of Cotopaxi, the volcano we plan on visiting in a couple of days. Another death-defying cab ride later, we ended up at the Basilica del Foto Nacional. It's a beautiful Gothic-style cathedral with a fun South American twist. The gargoyles are animals native to Ecuador. The inside was lovely, with lots of beautiful stained glass windows and vaulted ceilings, but the real draw here is to climb the towers, so up we went. And up and up and up some more. This climb finishes with a rickety wooden walkway over top of the vaulted ceilings and a series of ladders so steep they would run afoul of any public safety laws in Canada.
Towers from below, medium.
We were just barely back at ground level when it started to rain in earnest. It quickly picked up to a full downpour accompanied by thunder. The foyer of the basilica was filling up with tourists waiting out the storm. As it let up a bit and a few groups trickled out, Andrew asked if I thought we should make a go of it with our plastic rain ponchos. I looked out to evaluate and suggested waiting 5 more minutes. Not 30 seconds later, the skies opened back up and it started hailing. The docent locked down all the doors and closed us in as the hail pellets bounced under the doors. As the 5 o'clock closing time drew nearer, we could see the clouds breaking up with blue skies showing through and knew that it was soon going to stop. At about 4:55, we ponchoed up and headed out. It stopped about 2 minutes later. On our walk back, we picked up some pastries and fruit for breakfast tomorrow, as we have a very early morning ahead. We're catching an 8 o'clock sightseeing train called Tren de los Volcanos, or Train of the Volcanoes. On a clear day, you're supposed to be able to see 15 volcanoes on the ride south through the valley. Tren de los Volcanes, April 22, 2018. We were up before most of Quito this morning. Everyone except for the nightly 5 am parade, which woke us both up this time. We're still at a loss to explain why this is taking place. Our street was full of rose petals when we got up, presumably left by the parade. We caught a taxi to the train station and checked in for our 8 a.m. trip with no problem. The tour seems very popular with domestic tourists. There were maybe 8 non-Ecuadorian people on the train, ourselves included. One of the stewards asked where we were from, then announced it to the whole car, and they all clapped to welcome us. They also decorated our seating section with some colourful braided rope, a postcard and a balloon. I always find it interesting seeing a city from the rail line. It's like a forgotten space. Quito was very different though. Our train was escorted by a squad of motorcyclists who would leapfrog ahead and block traffic at each crossing point, because most of the crossings are unsignalled. As soon as the train arrived, off they would go on to their next point. Rail lines are also frequently heavily graffitied, and Quito was no different. It took us about 40 minutes to get clear of the city. On the outward bound trip we had one quick stop, where we were given some kind of delicious egg-filled pastry. There was also a selection of local foods on offer for purchase, but we had come prepared with our own snacks. After this stop it was mainly rural from then on to our ultimate destination of El Boliche. We had beautiful sunny skies and clear views of all but the very highest peaks, which create their own cloud systems. I got to play with my photosphere lens today, which was fun, even when I forgot about physics and almost burned a hole in my hand. At El Boliche there was some kind of artisan talk or sales pitch, but it was all in Spanish, so mostly lost on us. Once that was over, we went for a short nature walk with an English-speaking guide. She showed us some medicinal plants and talked about the forest. After this, we were free to wander and get something to eat in the cafe. Then it was all aboard for our return trip, with a stop in Machete. As we pulled into the station, it started raining quite lightly, which was good because there was a traditional dance troupe in the station square ready to perform for us. They did 2 different routines, and they were quite good. It reminded me a lot of being at Carousel of Nations and watching the cultural dances. Once the dancing was over, we walked down the tracks a bit to a horse ranch and hacienda, where we were served a nice lunch of grilled chicken with potatoes, salad and rice. Then the owner, who was quite the showman, led us outside to show off the various breeds of horses they have. This was all in Spanish, so I only caught snippets. As he led us around to the back of the property, he stopped to talk about this particular plant that was used for blessings and purification of the soul. Then he began walking around pretending to bless people. He stopped at Andrew and looked up. He only came up to his chest level. I'm not really sure what he said, but I think he called him an angel, and whatever else he said made everyone laugh. We carried on to the back, where there's a variety of livestock and farm animals that make up a petting farm. We were offered buffalo mozzarella made on the farm and some tasty fruit preserves. It was a shame we couldn't buy any, but I doubt we'd be allowed to bring it through customs. After about 2 hours here, we headed back to the train and headed back to Quito. It rained heavily most of the way back, but about 10 minutes from the station everything was totally dry. We've been pretty lucky with the weather, really. We're leaving Friends Hostel tomorrow to join our G Adventures itinerary. We had wanted to do a day trip to the Cotopaxi volcano, but I'm wavering on that now, as I sit exhausted with sore legs from all the climbing. I'll have to see how I feel in the morning.
Thank you very much. Damas y caballeros, estamos cerca.
Day of rest, April 23, 2018. We determined that when we arrive back in Quito, we have a full day available to us before a 10 p.m. flight, and we may consider Cotopaxi at that point, or another tour. Today, we slept in. There was, mercifully, no 5 a.m. parade. We asked the front desk girl, Joanna, and she said she heard it too, but wasn't totally sure what it was about either. She thought it was some form of religious procession. We had breakfast on the Plaza Grande in a cafe inside the former catacombs of the cathedral. It was a very lively morning in the plaza, with some sort of memorial for the 30-year anniversary of the death of a social activist. There was an extremely heavy police presence, including the bomb detection unit with mirrors to see under ledges, and at least 5 German shepherds. It seemed a bit incongruous for a bunch of kids performing with their school band, but we found out later that there was a much larger demonstration to take place later, a march for peace. After breakfast, the general plan was to wander around. We headed for Plaza San Francisco, one of the largest open plazas in Quito. It's all cobblestoned and flanked on one side by the San Francisco Cathedral. The church is reportedly built on the ruins of Atahualpa's palace, the last Inca ruler. If I'm being completely honest, I was feeling fairly blah about going. But the second we walked into that church, I was so glad we didn't miss it. I've seen a lot of cathedrals around the world, but I've never seen anything quite like this. The whole thing is gilded from floors to rafters. It was really something else. After the cathedral, we visited a very unique fair trade shop housed in the former catacombs. It carried on down a series of tunnels and side rooms for quite a distance. I bought a small ceramic bowl, traditionally painted by tribeswomen using their hair. I'm unclear if it's still attached to their heads when they paint with it, or in brush form. Wandering outside of the heavily touristy areas was so interesting. We got a peek behind the scenes, so to speak, at the daily business of Quito. Lots of deliveries happening, road works being done by hammer, and chisel and people going about their daily hustle. We walked down to the famous Bohemian street known as La Ronda, where there are many artisans and restaurants. Unfortunately for us, the Bohemians apparently take Monday mornings off, and 90% of businesses were closed. Still, it was a nice walk. We returned to Friends' hostel one last time to get our bags and caught a taxi to Gringolandia, the site of our first G Adventures accommodation, Hotel Eugenia. It only has 34 rooms and seems fairly newly opened, even though the building seems to have lived a previous incarnation as another hotel. We spent a couple of hours lazing around the hotel room, which was thoroughly enjoyable. We met with our group at 5 p.m. for our welcome meeting. There will be 16 of us altogether, but only 13 had arrived in time for the meeting. We are the only couple, and aside from 3 American girls travelling together, everyone else are solo travellers on extended holidays and world tours. One man from Denmark has been travelling since April of last year. We all met up in the lobby after the meeting and headed over to the Plaza Foch, which is heavily touristy with bars, clubs and restaurants. I had already decided on an Ecuadorian restaurant called Miskay. As we arrived in the plaza, we let everyone know where we were going, and they all decided to join us, so we had some time to socialize and get to know one another over food. The restaurant was still serving a Holy Week specialty called fanesca. It's a bean soup made with 12 different legumes and vegetables. It was so good. For my main course I had lengue, or cow tongue, which was also delicious, though I couldn't finish it all for being full on bean soup. Back at the hotel now. We get breakfast at 3:45 a.m. and leave for the airport at 4:15 a.m. Our flight is sometime in the 6 o'clock hour and should take 2.5 hours with a short pit stop in Guayaquil. Then we board a bus, a ferry, and another bus before arriving at our first stop in the Galapagos, Puerto Ayora. Our guide told us that there will be internet, but it won't be very good. Galapagos, Day 1, 2 and 3. April 24 to April 26, 2018. We woke up at 3:15 a.m. 2 days ago to catch what was supposed to be a 6:45 a.m. flight, but ended up delayed until around 8 a.m. The flight was about 2.5 hours, with a stop in Guayaquil to pick up more passengers. We arrived at the airport on Baltra Island, to the north of Santa Cruz Island. The landscape is very scrubby and desert-like in appearance, but it was also incredibly humid. A short bus ride to the pier, a short ferry ride across the channel, and a much longer bus ride later, we arrived at our first campsite, Cerro Mesa. It was, in a word, rustic. An open-air dining area and the communal bathrooms are the only structures on site. Situated back in the forest a bit was a winding path with our campsites, which were small two-man Coleman tents on raised platforms with 2 mattresses and some sheets. We settled in a bit and then headed out for our first adventure, a visit to the El Manzanillo Tortoise Reserve for our first encounter with Galapagos giant tortoises. The reserve used to be a farm at one point, but as preferred tortoise habitat, they were fighting a losing battle against grazing. They turned their attentions to ecotourism instead. There's no active breeding program here, and the tortoises are left to roam in a mostly natural lifestyle. There are tortoises here of all ages and sizes. I was not prepared for how much tortoise poop there was lying around, or the sheer size of it. After our visit to the reserve, we went to a hilltop for a little scenic rest stop before dinner. We watched the sunset and walked back down to camp. Dinner was at 7, and we were settled into our tent by 9 p.m. on account of the very early morning we had had. Unfortunately, in an attempt to further waterproof the tent, a plastic tarp had been layered on top and could not be removed, so it was like sleeping inside a plastic bag, as Andrew put it. At 3:30 a.m. he woke up and said there was a moth or something hitting his head. I went back to sleep. Then 10 minutes later I was also gently attacked. We put on our lights and glasses and tracked down the culprit, a tiny frog that I swiftly tossed out the door. After a not great night of sleep, we were up at the crack of dawn to pack up and eat breakfast. We headed into Puerto Ayora, dropped our bags off at the pier and went to visit the Charles Darwin Research Station. We got some lessons in native plants, endemic species and invasive species control efforts on our walk to the station. We got to see tortoises at various stages of growth, from 3-month-old hatchlings to the breeding adults representing the various species.
And sometimes like old snakes, you only see the...
We got to see Super Diego from the Hispaniola Islands subspecies, who has almost single-handedly brought his species back from the brink of extinction. We also got to view the preserved remains of Lonesome George, who was the last of his species found in the 70s on Pinta Island and never reproduced. He died, the last of his kind, in 2012. After our visit, we had some free time to either go to the beach or explore the town. If you know me at all, you'd know my choice right away. As we walked back to our meeting point, we got to see one of the 5 snake species that live here. Some marine iguanas, sea lions, pelicans and magnificent frigate birds. We also got in a bit of souvenir shopping. We then had a group lunch and boarded our speedboat, via water taxi, to head over to Floriana Island, the least populous of the 4 inhabited islands here. Floriana has struggled in the past to capitalize on tourist dollars. G Adventures has committed to a capacity-building cooperative here to help develop the community. Through grants and training and hospitality services, they have helped local entrepreneurs establish guest houses and restaurants. When G Adventures brings groups here, they spread the group across various guest houses and take us for meals at different restaurants for every meal to help spread the wealth. Our group is spread across 4 guest houses. Once we settled into our rooms, we regrouped and went for a snorkel at a nearby black sand beach. Unfortunately, as it had been raining and there was quite a bit of surf, the water was fairly murky. But it gave Andrew a good chance to get comfortable with his new prescription snorkel mask. At dinner that night, everyone made a big fuss over my birthday. Andrew had brought a pink cake thing and candles all the way from home, and everyone sang me happy birthday. Then afterwards, our guide Danilo announced that he had arranged for the restaurant to bake me a cake as well, so everyone sang again, and we all had cake. Yesterday, what I thought was just a strange cough associated with altitude sickness had developed into a full-blown throat infection. So I've been feeling pretty crummy. I powered through this morning when we took a trip to the highlands and learned some history of the island and its original colonizer. After lunch, we had about an hour of free time. It had been raining on and off all morning, and when it started up again as we were meant to go snorkeling again, I opted to stay in and get some sleep while Andrew went with the group. I think I was out before he even left the room. He came back with some great videos of sea turtles that they saw, and he ended up really enjoying it. So I'm glad he was able to experience that. Tomorrow morning, we leave for Isabella Island right after breakfast. We're visiting another tortoise breeding centre, a flamingo lagoon, and hiking up the Sierra Negra volcano. We're camping there again, but our guide had said that the tents are much larger and nice here. I hope so, since we have 2 nights there. Galapagos, Day 4. April 27, 2018. This blog post has been delayed in coming thanks to an illness I've been fighting since my birthday. I've rarely been so sick for so long. I've had a terrible cough and chest congestion, and then I got pink eye in both eyes, so that was pretty special. I owe a huge thank you to Andrew for carrying me through the last few days of our trip. Without him, I'd probably still be curled up in the fetal position in our hostel on Santa Cruz. We're back home now, and I'm still fighting this respiratory bug, but now I've got antibiotics on my side. In spite of my health struggles, the last few days of our trip were nothing short of magical. In my last post, I forgot to mention the pirate mailbox on Floriana Island. Established back in the 18th century by whalers, people leave postcards and letters here with the hopes that somebody travelling near to their intended destination will pick it up and deliver it for them. Believe it or not, Andrew found a postcard destined for Amherstburg, posted only the day before. We brought it home with us and will hand-deliver it shortly. There was another destined for London, Ontario that we were sorely tempted to pick up, but decided against in the end. On Friday morning, we left Floriana Island on a speedboat headed for Isabella Island. On our way over, we encountered a pod of dolphins who were enjoying themselves surfing our wake. The boat captain circled for a while, letting us enjoy the show. We arrived on Isabella Island to a balmy 29 degrees Celsius day and visited the tortoise breeding centre here. They only breed species native to Isabella here. We got to see the most adorable baby tortoise stampede.
That's amazing. I'm not going to take any photos because everyone else will.
We were also lucky enough to witness the centre's main business in action. So graceful. From there, we walked out along a boardwalk through the salt marshes to see the flamingos and other water birds, including some black-necked stilts, soras and blue-winged teals. After some free time for lunch, we all boarded our Shiva bus, the name means goat, and drove up to the highlands of the Sierra Negra volcano. From the base camp, it was meant to be a relatively easy 25-minute walk up. The caldera is the largest in the Galapagos at 7 by 9 kilometers in size. As we drove up, it started raining. The park ranger offered us a motley selection of improvised hiking poles, and I ended up with a cane, even though the altitude was only a fraction of that in Quito. My respiratory ailment made it so that the hike up was a struggle for every step. The rain went from a light drizzle to a full pour, but my raincoat was suffocating me. We finally made it up, with Andrew and I several minutes behind the much more sprightly group of young uns and the ranger's dog. I'd like to say we were treated to expansive views of the impressive caldera. But really it looked more like this. Oh well, at least I can say I was there, and I did it. Everyone was thoroughly dampened after the hike as we arrived at our new campground, Campo Duro Eco Lodge. The name means hard country. We had 10 minutes to drop our bags off in our tents, change and head back into town. While the group gathered on the beach, Andrew and I went to find a grocery store where I could stock up on Kleenex. We joined back up and sat on the beach while the group members who were to go diving got outfitted with their gear. We all regrouped around 7 to head back to the camp for an 8 o'clock dinner. The tents were nicer, as promised. They were about twice as wide and could be stood up in. They were also not smothered in plastic, so airflow was slightly improved. The mattresses were also more comfortable. They were set up along the far edge of a grassy patch across from the dining area. There were 2 heated indoor showers and 2 natural outdoor showers. The shower actually proved to be pretty nice. The water pressure was good. It was warm, and there was a nice window ledge to put your dry stuff. As a bonus for Andrew and I, as the shower facility was set fairly far back into the bush area, it attracted a nice selection of moths. We won't mention the equally diverse selection of gigantic spiders it also attracted. I was going to wrap up the whole trip on this post, but I think the next day deserves its own post, so I will end here. Galapagos, Day 5. April 28, 2018. Day 5 was our optional activities day. Individually, we could choose from several paid activities. These included kayaking, surf lessons, a snorkel trip to a site called Tintoriras, a snorkel trip to a site called Los Túneles, or a scuba dive for those certified. Andrew and I opted for the Los Túneles snorkel as it came highly recommended in everything we read. Another 4 people from our group joined us, as well as another 2 couples who were visiting the island. We were led by Eduardo. A naturalist guide and the Ecuadorian John Travolta piloted our boat. We had a 45-minute boat ride to the site, during which we circled a rock outcrop which serves as a nesting site for Nazca boobies, a species closely related to the blue-footed variety. As we arrived at Los Túneles, John Travolta did a masterful job piloting us through the volcanic rock formations at a dead slow speed. The area was formed as a result of a lava flow. As the rock cooled and hardened in places on the outside, it continued to flow on the inside, creating lava tunnels. Over centuries of weathering and erosion, many of these tunnels have become exposed. The site is favoured by blue-footed boobies for nesting. Honestly, this may have been the highlight of the whole trip for me. Not only did we get to see the boobies, we got to see the males doing their courting dance. We watched as 2 males competed for the attentions of one female, and she chose one over the other, and they mated, all as we looked on. After watching the boobies and having an Instagram moment on one particularly picturesque lava bridge, we jumped in the water for our first snorkel. We had already been seeing massive sea turtles swimming in the water, and once we got in the water, Eduardo knew exactly where to take us for the best animal encounters. At this site and another, he delivered on his promise of both white-tipped and black-tipped reef sharks. seahorses, sea turtles in abundance, and a variety of other creatures. On our return trip back to Puerto Villamil, we also encountered a school of about 8 large rays. He called them manta rays, but they didn't look to have the classic filter-feeding fines on their heads, so I'm not too sure which species they were. As we regrouped and heard from the people who went on the other tours, it turns out that everyone had a special animal encounter. The snorkelers at Tintoriras got to swim with sea lions and marine iguanas, while the divers got to see hammerhead sharks and giant manta rays. It was really nice that everyone got to see something special. It would have been awful if one group or another had missed out. As we waited for everyone to come back, there was quite a gathering of small marine iguanas at the beach bar. I went over to take some pictures in hopes of capturing one of them sneezing out salt water, and couldn't believe my luck when I actually managed to record it. This day basically hit all the high notes that I could have hoped for from the Galapagos Islands. Two new dots. A recap. After our amazing day of snorkeling on Isabela Island, the rest of the trip is a bit of a postscript. We stayed another night in a lovely hostel back on Santa Cruz that even had air conditioning. It was quite a treat. We all went out together for one last group meal in a street that transformed at night into a full-on dining extravaganza. I had ordered the most amazing seafood pasta that was just perfectly done, but I could hardly taste it thanks to my cold. Anyway, it was a nice wrap-up, even if we had to cut it short. The next morning we flew back to Quito and essentially did nothing for the next 2 days. I was disappointed to have missed out on doing a nice excursion on our last day, but I was in such misery by this time I just couldn't bring myself to do anything. I actually considered 2 options: moving up our flight to get back for medical care or finding an Ecuadorian hospital. Thankfully, Andrew found me some over-the-counter medication that made the next couple days and flight home bearable. Since our flight wasn't until 11:30 p.m, we found a place that did day-use rates near to the airport called Quito Airport Suites. Our taxi driver had no idea where this place was. We turned on Google navigation in Spanish to get us there. It looked like a bit of a sketchy neighborhood, if I'm being completely honest, but the hotel was really quite nice and secure. $28 to not sit in an airport all day was totally worth it. We spent the day marathoning whatever English television we could find, and I spent it in and out of sleep. So while the trip ended somewhat ignominiously, it was like 98% amazing. And I want to go over some impressions and takeaways of Ecuador, the Galapagos Islands and G-Adventures. This is going to get long, so if the minutiae of travel details don't interest you, this is where you should get off. Thanks for coming along on our adventure, and we hope you'll join us again next time too. Reading up on Ecuador, everything sort of warns you that petty theft and robberies are a common occurrence in Quito. And so we went into this trip on high alert. Because of the relative lack of items and general use of cash, over credit, we travelled with all the cash we were going to need on this trip already on hand. There's an obvious level of risk involved in carrying moderate sums of cash around a place with a reputation for pickpocketing and hold-ups. We tempered this by splitting up the cash in several places between the 2 of us, so that if ever anything should happen, it was highly unlikely that we would lose all of our money in one shot. Maybe it's because at 6'4" Andrew makes an intimidating target, or maybe it's because the police are everywhere, or maybe it's just because the internet has overblown the situation. But I never once felt unsafe or likely to be robbed at any point. Quito has its panhandlers like any other major city, but they aren't looking for trouble. In any case, it's good to keep your wits about you, but you should never let something you read online negatively influence your impression of a place before you even give it a chance. In planning our stay in Quito, it never crossed my mind to try and find a Hilton or other big-name hotel. Hostels are definitely the way to go in South America. We got a private double room with private bath and free Wi-Fi right in the heart of the historic district for about $35 a night. There's nothing more that a Wyndham can offer me for $150 per night. Maybe this is how I avoided discovering the existence of Gringolandia until 2 days before we left. If a 5-star hotel is your speed, there are plenty to go around. They just aren't located anywhere really interesting, so you'll need to take taxis around to see the good stuff. Mind you, Gringolandia aka La Mariscal is where we ate our best Ecuadorian food, so there's something to be said for that. Because of the vast expanse that Quito covers, getting around can be daunting. There's a massive fleet of taxis under numerous companies. They all have meters, but very few use them. It's best to ask the fare to your destination before you get in, but it's worth noting that, aside from the airport, our most expensive fare was still less than $10 and most were about $3. Other forms of public transit include buses and a streetcar system, but I never saw them at anything less than full capacity. Good news, though, they are building an underground metro line that's opening in July of 2019 and should be pretty straightforward to ride. There's also a bike-sharing system and a pretty decent system of bike lanes and a hop-on, hop-off tourist bus. Quito's historic centre didn't disappoint in the least. It was recognized by UNESCO as being one of the largest and most intact Spanish colonial cities in Latin America. It seems like most people travelling to Ecuador are in transit to the Galapagos and probably miss out on most of Quito. But with churches dating back to 1534, beautiful plazas and gorgeous, colourful buildings everywhere, it's worth a couple days unto itself. As a city, I found it to be comparable to a mix between Cusco in Peru and La Paz in Bolivia. It has the historic feel of Cusco, but also the chaotic, modern energy of La Paz. The one thing that I found disappointing is that in spite of being obviously very proud of their indigenous cultures and roots, there's so little Quechua culture or Incan history to be found here. Whereas in Cusco, you can't throw a stone without hitting an Incan ruin. If there are Incan sites in Quito, I didn't readily hear about them. Now, on to the Galapagos Islands. Pretty much all you ever hear about when it comes to travelling to the Galapagos is cruises. This is by far the dominant form of tourism here, and it's a lucrative one for the companies involved. Unfortunately for the people of the Galapagos Islands, it doesn't seem like they see too much of those tourist dollars. Many cruises board right from Baltra Island, directly off their flights from Quito. The towns are essentially shut down during the day when all the cruisers are on their excursions. When we started looking at the Galapagos as a destination, it didn't seem like there was any other way to do it. Then we found this G Adventures tour, the Galapagos Camping Adventure. It was a reasonable price point, covered flights to the islands, accommodations, many meals and a good range of activities, both included and optional. It seemed like an ideal alternative and an easy trip as our first big trip together without having to worry about logistics. Now, having been there, I can confidently say that you can do the Galapagos Islands as solo or couple travellers. There are guest houses and hostels in abundance, as well as tour operators every 5 feet on Santa Cruz and Isabela Islands. There are inter-island ferries twice a day between Santa Cruz, Isabela, and San Cristobal Islands. So if the group tour vibe is not for you, fear not, you can still go to the Galapagos Islands. The Galapagos Islands consist of 21 islands of varying size. There are only 4 that are inhabited and the rest are protected as part of the national park. These 4 are Santa Cruz, San Cristobal, Isabela and Floriana. Of these, Floriana is the smallest and least populated. Isabela is the largest in area and Santa Cruz is the most populous. These are the 3 islands that we visited. If you've been following along up to this point, you can probably guess that our favourite island was Isabela, thanks to the animal encounters we had there. Santa Cruz was also pretty solid for its lively waterfront and the Charles Darwin Research Centre. Unfortunately, the best thing I can say for Floriana is that our guest house was really lovely. I can appreciate what G Adventures is trying to do with their community building efforts, but I don't think it's quite there yet. Maybe our experience there was tainted by 2 days of rain. It's hard to say. As I said, our guest house was lovely and the hospitality at the restaurants was also good, but the food wasn't really anything to write home about. The snorkeling was fairly mediocre and our hike to the highlands was largely forgettable. G Adventures classifies their trips by travel style. Some examples include classic marine, family, and active. This particular trip fell into their 18 to 30-somethings category, formerly known as YOLO style, which is strictly reserved for travellers 18 to 39 years old. At 34 and 35, we definitely drove up the average age of the group. Everyone was really nice and we all got along great, but I definitely felt like I was travelling at a different speed to most of the others. At the end of a long day, when all I wanted to do was go back to our camp and sleep, everyone else was gearing up for drinking and dancing. If we were to ever do another G Adventures tour, I think we'd probably go for a classic-style trip next time. If I were to make recommendations for G Adventures about how this trip could be changed or improved, they would be as follows. If they're set on this staying a camping adventure, I'd like to see the facilities at our first camp, Serra Mesa, improved in terms of the tents. Tents more like we had at Campo Duro would make that a much nicer introductory experience. I would prefer to have the time spent on Floriana knocked down to 1 night only, giving us more time on Isabela to do another optional activity. It would have been nice to have time to actually explore the grounds at Campo Duro, which is more than just a campsite, but an eco-lodge with restoration projects on site. Lastly, I think that they could still offer a budget-minded tour like this one, but without the camping. It's not that I so strongly disliked the camping that I would do away with it just for the sake of it. It's just that the campsites were so remote, it really limited our ability to set any kind of independent schedule as we had to come and go as a group at all times. Given the number of hostels and guest houses centrally located on these islands and their relative affordability, there's no reason this couldn't be a hostel adventure instead of a camping adventure for nearly the same price point. And that's a wrap. If travel minutiae are your thing and you stuck it out this long, I hope you got something useful out of this essay. Or at the very least you enjoyed the pictures. Until next time.